And we're recording. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see you. For those who celebrate Happy International Women's Day, today's March 8th, a day to recognize the contributions that the people who identify as women have brought to our worlds, and the value that they continue to add, and the light that is contributed through their presence and active contributions. So if this is a holiday that you as an individual celebrate, I would like to acknowledge that. If there are powerful, inspirational women in your life, please extend them the appreciation that you've received here today. Today, I would ask that all of the fellows, if you don't mind sticking around after the formal part of the presentation today for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. I do have some general housekeeping things to address with y'all that is not important for our external speaker to be privy to, more about scheduling and spring break, because I don't know when y'all are going to be around and how that will impact subsequent meetings. But with that in mind, and recognizing that we are recording, and this is a conversation I have been very excited about all semester. There has been some previewing of it in past classes, but today we get to hear from Thomas Chittum with SoundThinking. SoundThinking was, I'm sure he can go into the evolution of it, but the area of focus for many of you, both in this room as well as in past fellows classes, is around the technology of Shotspotter. And so very much looking forward to hearing about the value that this technology has brought and the potential expansion for it. For those who follow this conversation closely, there has been a fair bit of information about it in the news recently, and so curious to see how the research being done by SoundThinking has informed what current policy will look like, as well as where it is going in the future. So, Tom, I pulled up a quick bio, but please correct me if and where I am wrong. But Mr. Chittum was an Associate Deputy Director at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives for over 25 years. He most recently was the Associate Deputy Director of the ATF, where he oversaw a staff of 5,000 employees, including special agents, investigators, intelligence professionals, and support personnel, as well as a budget of $1.5 billion. He enforced a wide range of federal criminal laws during his time at the ATF, especially related to firearms and violent crime, and played an integral role in promoting the U.S. Department of Justice's adoption and use of crime gun intelligence tools and tactics. We had a really thought-provoking and great conversation earlier in the year, and so I'm delighted that you're able to share your experience and expertise with the class here today. I cede the floor to you, Tom.
Appreciate the invitation. Thank you, Jessalyn. It always pains me to listen to people read my bio, but I did plan to start by talking a little bit about my background because I think it's helpful to know the perspective and experience that I bring to what it is I do today. As Jessalyn mentioned, I worked an entire career at the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And I started out as a plain old agent working cases in the field. I moved around throughout my career as I advanced through promotion. I worked in Miami. I worked in Kentucky. I worked in Las Vegas. I oversaw ATF's Internal Affairs Division. I was an assistant special agent in charge in Seattle. I was in charge of ATF's Special Operations Division. I was a special agent in charge in the Washington Field Division. I also oversaw Detroit for a while. And then I had a number of positions in ATF headquarters. And when I retired from the agency in 2022, I was the acting deputy director. So I was the number 2 in charge of the agency. In my spare time, I also started teaching a law class, firearms law and the Second Amendment, partly because I was still working for ATF at the time. I presented it as a viewpoint neutral examination of the history, constitutional, Doctrine and Modern State of Gun Law in America. I still teach that course today. Thankfully, one of the silver linings of COVID, the law school that I teach for, Boyd School of Law at UNLV, still keeps some online courses, and mine is one of them. I travel a lot in my current position, and that sort of flexibility allows me to continue teaching, which I love doing. In fact, I taught a class last night from the road. And so I'm happy to be joining you guys today. So I retired in 2022, not quite 2 years ago, and I immediately came to work for the company that was then called Shotspotter. As you mentioned in the beginning, the company rebranded, and the company is now known as SoundThinking. The reason why is because the company has a portfolio of solutions that go beyond gunshot detection. The company is best known for its gunshot detection system, ShotSpotter, but it also has a case management solution, a patrol management solution, and other tools. And so the company rebranded to better reflect its position as a platform. But we're still largely known for our gunshot detection system, and I'll talk a bit about that. When I was working at ATF, I very often represented the men and women of ATF in public remarks all across the country. And I would very often talk about the tools, tactics, and technology of crime gun intelligence. You mentioned that earlier on. It's not hyperbole to say technology is helping revolutionize the way that we can investigate gun crime. But when I came to ShotSpotter, it turns out I didn't know as much about this tool as I thought that I did. I really only thought of it as a pointer system, and I never thought of it, even though it seems so obvious to me. Now, in retrospect, I never thought of it as showing up in the courtroom. It turns out there was just so much more that you could do with it than I realized. And a big part of what it is I do here at the company now is help people understand the tool in ways that they can get the most out of it. I also end up representing the company in public remarks pretty regularly, trying to demystify what it is we do, overcome some misunderstandings of the system, and just help people realize the potential of the tool. I have a presentation that I'll work through. Let me see if I can share it. All right. Can you see it okay? And in a moment, we'll know if you can hear it okay too. I've got some sound on the second slide. So I described what I do, or what I did at ATF. I was an agent, but I am also an attorney. I mean, I guess that's maybe self-evident from teaching the law class. I am presently the Senior Vice President of Forensic Services. All right, give me just 1 second. Okay, so what I hope to cover is, you hear that? Great. I'll give you a little bit of overview about the company. I've talked a little bit about it, but I'll give you some background on it because it's a pretty interesting origin story. I'll explain how the technology works to demystify it. If somebody had asked me to explain how ShotSpotter worked before I came to work here, I would have had to guess that it was powered by magic. How could it possibly do what it says it does? Turns out it's not magic at all. It's math and it's science and it's technology. And so I'll walk through some of that technology and you'll see that it's really based on simple principles. I'll describe some of the processes that we use. I'll talk about the ways that ShotSpotter can be used, and I'll hit some of the leading court cases. I'll talk about some of the privacy implications of the tool, and then I think we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So what is ShotSpotter? Well, as I mentioned, the company rebranded to SoundThinking Incorporated to better reflect its position as a platform. It was founded in the mid-90s in California. Our founder, Dr. Bob Schoen, could hear gunfire near where he lived, and it occurred to him that he might use the same processes that are used to locate the epicenter of earthquakes. He might use that same process to locate where the sound of gunfire originated from. And so he built a prototype. He was in his 50s at this time, and this was a new venture for him. It worked, and Shotspotter was born. Dr. Bob is still actively involved in the company today. Really a very interesting guy. And he has always embraced the principle that technology's greatest use is for good. Our headquarters is still in California, and our CEO is a man named Ralph Clark. You mentioned following some of the news about ShotSpotter lately, you may have seen our CEO appearing at public hearings, because he and a lot of us routinely appear in public venues to talk about the company and the product. So the company went public in 2017. It's publicly traded on the NASDAQ right now. And because of that, we have a board of directors. Our most visible, well-known director is Bill Bratton. He was the twice commissioner of NYPD and the chief of LAPD. And he's one of the forefathers, the thought leaders of precision policing. And of course, ShotSpotter is a tool that lends itself to that sort of strategy. Because we're publicly traded, we also have shareholders that we answer to. And it also means that a lot of information about the company can be found in publicly available documents, SEC filings, but also documents like patents. I'll mention some of the patented processes that we use. So occasionally the company is accused of being secretive in some way, but the fact of the matter is much of the information any person might want to know is publicly available. So what does ShotSpotter do? Well, to the extent that you've heard of it, you know about the acoustic gunshot detection. As I mentioned, the company does other things, but the acoustic gunshot detection is the thing we're most known for. And what it does is produce near real-time alerts to outdoor gunfire. There are limitations to the tool. So gunfire that occurs, for instance, in enclosures may not trigger the system. We are focused on outdoor gunfire. That means we can provide the what, the when, and the where of gunfire, but not the who. That requires investigation. Sometimes we can provide the how, and I'll give you an example of that. The value of this is it allows police to respond quickly and render aid to gunshot wound victims, potentially saving lives. It allows them to collect the valuable ballistic evidence that is left behind at many shootings. They often seize crime guns and can arrest offenders. But if used thoughtfully, it can also help improve policing generally and build stronger connections with the community. And I'll describe some specific ways that works. Also, we save rhinos and coral reefs. So many people don't know this, but we actually have a system deployed at a wildlife preserve in South Africa where we help detect poaching of black rhinos. Prior to the deployment of our system in that park, rangers had to rely on their ears and drive around vast swaths of savanna at night trying to find poachers. Now, when a gun is fired in the park, we detect it, locate it, and notify them of its precise location so they can respond. And it cut down poaching of black rhinos by half in just a single year. Now, you would think, oh, that seems like a very good conservation effort, and it is. There's value in saving rhinos for that purpose. But it's also important to recognize that their horns draw a very large price on black market, and that helps fuel organized crime. So in a lot of ways, there are tangential values to doing that. With the underwater reefs, we actually have a system deployed off the coast of Malaysia, where it detects fish blasting, fish bombing, people fishing with explosives, which of course imperils coral reefs, but it also has consequences for the food source and the employment of a lot of people that live in that area. But what most people know ShotSpotter for is the issue of gun violence in America. We are, of course, a company and we have customers and we give them certain guarantees. It provides them a financial incentive to give us feedback because it is important to us that we get it right. We guarantee that we will detect 90% of unsuppressed outdoor gunfire of greater than 25 caliber. Why all those qualifiers? Because our system depends on loudness to function. So a firearm that was equipped with a suppressor may not make a loud enough report to trigger our system. Gunfire that occurs in an enclosure like a home or a car may not trigger our system. Or small caliber firearms like 22 calibers may not be loud enough to trigger our system. Doesn't mean that the system can never detect those things. Sometimes we do. But our system operates in a dynamic real world environment where myriad factors can influence it. And so this is where we set the standard that we will meet. We also guarantee that we'll be accurate 90% of the time within 25 meters, and that we will publish our alerts 90% of the time within 1 minute of the gunfire occurring. When you're dealing with gunfire in an urban area, time is of the essence. And if we don't meet these standards, our customers pay us less. That gives them an incentive to provide us ground truth. Occasionally, ShotSpotter will miss gunfire. There are reasons why that happens. It's the reason that our guarantee is 90%, because no system that operates in the real world could be 100%. And we use that feedback to improve the performance of the system. You may ask yourself, well, what about 911? Isn't that the whole point of 911, to call police when gunfire occurs? But research shows that about 80%, or 4 out of 5 incidents of gunfire in urban areas, go unreported to police. There are a variety of reasons why that is. Some of them are simply practical. A lot of gunfire occurs in the late night hours when people are asleep. They may be awakened by a loud sound but not know what it is, and so they don't call. But there are some heartbreaking reasons. In a lot of places, people have just resigned themselves to dealing with this, living in an environment where gunfire is the norm, or they fear retaliation if they cooperate with police, and they're reluctant to call for fear that a marked unit may come to their house and people may think that they're cooperating. Sometimes it's because they simply aren't sure what they heard. They think maybe they heard gunfire, but they don't know exactly where, and they don't want to call with no real information. Or sometimes they assume that someone else will call, but no one else does. And that means a lot of missed opportunities for police to respond. Very often it means gunshot wound victims may not receive the aid that they need. But just as bad, the community thinks police know about all gunfire. So they look out their window, they say, I heard gunfire. When did the police show up? And when police don't show up, they think it's because they have abandoned them, that police don't care about them. But I don't believe that's true. I think police do want to protect and serve. And so ShotSpotter helps fill that void. Even when someone does call 911, there is typically a delay as they go and they call and they describe what they believe they've heard. But they don't have any special training at distinguishing a gunfire from non-gunfire. They have limited information they can offer most of the time. They say, I heard what I think was gunfire. It sounded like it came from out front. They can't say whether or not that was 1 block over, 2 blocks over, or more. And the sound of gunfire will travel long distances in an urban area, as much as a mile or more. They don't have an audio recording of the gunfire to listen to again or let police listen to. But sometimes callers to 911 have helpful information that ShotSpotter simply doesn't have. They may be able to describe people that they saw on the scene. They may be able to give the description of a car. And so it's still vital that the community have confidence in the police, that they call when they have information about gunfire. So how does the system work? Well, at a very basic level, we deploy our sensors in high locations around an area. A gun is fired and the sound travels out and hits our sensors. We use a process of locating where that sound originated from. And then human reviewers in our incident review center review alerts, determine if it involved gunfire or not, and if so, publish it to the police so they can respond. But I think it's helpful to understand the system at a deeper level to demystify it. And so to really understand what's going on, you have to understand some basics of sound. So acoustics is a branch of physics. It is the study of the movement of waves through an elastic medium. And here we're talking about sound waves moving through air. And we know that sound moves at a constant speed, 343 meters a second, at room temperature, which scientists will tell you is about 68 degrees. That suggests that weather plays a role in how fast sound travels. In fact, sound will travel faster in a hotter environment than a colder environment. It will travel faster and further with the wind than against the wind. It will travel faster in a humid environment than it will a drier environment. It's also affected by structures like buildings and billboards, or the foliage on trees, or the terrain. And it has a few characteristics that are important to understand. First of all, it will reflect off of objects. You know those reflections as echoes. It will reflect off of hard objects like glass and concrete better than it will off of soft materials like the earth, which has a tendency to absorb acoustic energy. Sound will also diffract or bend around objects. So if I was standing on one side of a house and you were on the other side of the house and I yelled loudly for you, you could hear me because the sound bends around objects. Sound also attenuates as it travels over distances, or it weakens. And the way sound propagates or spreads out is omnidirectional, like a bubble expanding in all directions. But by virtue of the way the sound of gunfire is made, it tends to be eridirectional. So the sensors that we deploy them in a distributed array, which is just a way of saying we spread them around an area that has historically suffered high rates of gun crime, measured by objective historical data like homicides and prior reports of gunfire. Our sensors are placed high above the street, 20, 30 feet or more, which does a couple things. It helps with our efficiency in detecting the sound of gunfire as it travels across the landscape, also minimizes the likelihood we would capture intelligible human voices occurring at street level. We place them on both public but also private structures. And because of that, we keep the locations secret, even from the police. So many of our sensors are deployed on government buildings like police buildings and city halls and that sort of thing. But most of our sensors are deployed on private property. Some of that private property is things like utility poles, but some of it's genuine private property, homes, stores, apartment buildings. And because of that, we keep those locations secret. We deploy the sensors ourselves, and we're not secretly deploying them onto police buildings. They, of course, know that those have been placed there, but we don't report the sensors to them. That is to protect the people who allow us to place our sensors from retaliation or harassment. It also protects the sensors themselves from vandalism, and it eliminates the likelihood that somebody may try to exploit that information and perhaps commit their violent crimes outside of the coverage area. The microphones on our sensors are just basic cell phone quality microphones, but they are equipped with GPS, and they are synced to the atomic clock because the way the system works depends on precise time and location. And the system is only triggered when 3 or more sensors detect a loud, impulsive sound, a bang, a boom, or pop. So if you were to go outside and slam a car door, It would make an impulsive sound, but probably not one loud enough to reach 3 or more sensors spread out over an area. If you went outside and screamed at the top of your lungs, that might reach 3 or more sensors, but it's not an impulsive sound. Only when a loud, impulsive sound hits 3 or more sensors is the system triggered. And then it goes through a process of determining the location. Using those 3 or more sensors and their known location, both from their onboarded GPS, but also because we have placed the sensors. It then reaches out and grabs weather data, because as we discussed, the speed of sound is affected by things like temperature and humidity and wind. And then a cloud-based location server goes through a process of calculating the time difference of arrival. So we know that the sound reached one sensor faster than another sensor and faster than another sensor. And by calculating the time difference of arrival, we can determine where the sound originated from using a process called multilateration. What is multilateration? Sometimes called parabolic positioning. It calculates parabola or curves between all the unique pairs of sensors that participate in detecting an event. And where the lines of those curves intersect is where the sound originated from. Now, this sounds high tech, and if you're not a math guy, and I'm not, it might be intimidating. But the fact of the matter is, this process is being used in navigation systems. I mentioned it is how scientists locate the epicenter of earthquakes. And even this idea of using sound and time difference of arrival to locate gunfire is not a new concept. So this is a German howitzer from World War I. And at the top is a photographic tape. And you can see that there's a date listed there, November 11th, 1918 at 11 a.m. That's 11/11 at 11. This is Armistice Day, or what we would later come to know as Veterans Day, and it marked the end of hostilities in World War I. But the Allies were using this process of sound ranging to locate where enemy artillery fire originated from. Wildlife researchers even use multilateration in some processes, like locating howling wolves. It's less intrusive than trying to fit them with GPS collars. Obviously, those systems are attuned to howling wolf sounds, not impulsive, loud sounds. But the point is, this process is being used in numerous applications. Now, you will sometimes hear people refer to it as triangulation. Triangulation is very similar to multilateration, but it's a distinct process. So once our system has detected and located a sound, it goes through the process of filtering out sounds that are not likely to be gunfire. We use an algorithm to remove sounds. It takes sounds that are not characteristic of gunfire and just dismisses them. The system doesn't hear the way you and I hear. It examines visual representations of sound, waveforms, and it's looking for indications that are characteristic of gunfire, like a steep, sharp rise and a steady decay. All around you, all the time, there is ambient noise. Until I said that, you were not consciously aware of it. Because the human brain is really great at dealing with ambient noise. Our system uses filters to deal with it. And then we use a patented mosaic process. And remember, I described before that the company actually owns many patents. One of them is exactly this. They're not hidden away in some hard to find place. You can find them right on our website. We use a process that we describe to go through and characterize whether something is or is not likely gunfire. Anything that's not likely gunfire is dismissed, and everything that is characteristic of gunfire is then transmitted to our Incident Review Center, or IRC. You hear that? All day long, reviewers in our IRC hear exactly that sound when they're presented with incidents, and they have to assess whether or not it's gunfire. Now, occasionally people think that our reviewers only use their ears and just listen to a sound and guess whether it's not gunfire, but that's just not the case. They also use their ears. They are listening to multiple audio snippets captured by different sensors, and they're listening for things that are consistent with gunfire, like the cadence of gunfire, like a consistent, steady pulse strength that is not overlapping. They're also using their ears, looking for clues that something is not gunfire, sizzling or whistling or popping associated with fireworks, the rev of an engine that precedes a backfire. But they're also looking at other pieces of information. For instance, they're presented with information about every sensor that detected the event. And remember, before we talked about the directional nature of how the sound of gunfire propagates. And so they're looking to see, what is the sensor participation? What's the shape of it? Does it encircle the point of origin, or is it off to one side or linear? They'll also look at things like distance to the nearest and furthest sensor. The sound of gunfire will travel further than a firecracker, and so the distance to the farthest sensor is one factor. They'll also consider situational issues. If it's 3 a.m., it's not likely road construction jackhammering. They'll also consider proximal events. So as sad as it is, sometimes gunfights in America drag out. And the system does not wait around to see, is this gunfight truly over or not? If there's a lull in the gunfire, we'll cut it off and send it as an alert. If the gunfire picks back up, a new incident will be created, and a human will be presented with that separate incident. But the system will alert them to other nearby occurring incidents. So they have that situational awareness to draw from. That and other factors they'll consider. And if it's gunfire, they will publish it to our customers, the police. And if it's not gunfire, they'll dismiss it. If they publish it, it goes as a real-time alert or near real-time. As I mentioned before, we guarantee that at least 90% of these will be published to our customers within 60 seconds of the gunfire. And it provides police with a lot of information. The approximate location of where the event occurred within the range that I mentioned, 25 meters, indicated here by this yellow halo. It will include an approximate round count. The system attempts to count how many rounds have just occurred. It provides police with navigation to that location. And here's something that's important to know about the system. It locates to a precise latitude and longitude. But latitude and longitude are not easy for police or people to understand and navigate to. So the system also goes and gets the nearest parcel address. Now, in a dense urban area, that's often very useful, small parcels. So 123 Main Street may be the parcel most closely associated with that latitude and longitude. But occasionally, it might be a very large parcel, like a park, where the street address may be on one side, but the actual incident occurred at a different place. And for those reasons, we always tell police that they should respond to the dot, not the street address. But street addresses are helpful for them to have some situational awareness to be able to record something in reports. And our system will help them navigate to that place. We also provide them with tactical intelligence when it's available to us. Based on some of the information that we can see, we can often tell if an incident involves multiple shooters. Because our system is precisely locating each round of gunfire in a volley, we can tell if a shooter is moving as he or she shoots and in what direction and at what speed. That's helpful for police to know that they may be responding to, say, a drive-by shooting. At the same time that that alert is published, police can generate an investigative lead summary, or an ILS. This is a computer-generated, on-demand, pre-formatted report that includes the basic details of the alert. It also includes embedded audio. So if you see each of those black bars that includes the waveform, those each represent an embedded audio snippet taken from a different sensor. So our customers can listen to this audio for themselves. Now, this is intended to serve, as the name suggests, investigative purposes. You can compare that to a detailed forensic report. What the system does immediately and automatically, humans can also go back and do manually. And we have people that do those detailed forensic analyses so that they can appear in court and offer expert witness testimony about things like timing, number of rounds, and location. As I mentioned, very often they can determine whether or not there were multiple shooters and which shooter fired first. They can also detect and measure movement and speed. Now, Shotspotter is simply a tool. It's one more tool in the toolbox for police. It works best when it is used with other tools. But like any tool, how you use it determines what sort of results you'll get from it. And there are certain best practices that we recommend police follow. For one, we encourage priority response. We know from our experience that very often our alerts help lead police to gunshot wound victims. In a single year in Oakland, California, we alerted police to more than 100 gunshot wound victims where there was no corresponding 911 call. Those are victims that would not have gotten the timely aid they did, but for ShotSpotter. And for that reason, we encourage priority response. It's also true that evidence can be ephemeral. Witnesses at crime scenes leave the area, and so a fast response is important for reasons like that too. For those same reasons, we encourage police to dispatch from the app that includes the alerts rather than being dispatched. And as I mentioned, respond to the dot, not the street address. Now, a lot of shootings occur late at night during the busiest times for police in less than ideal situations. And so we encourage, when they don't find immediate evidence of a shooting, to do a daylight follow-up. To go back when things are not as busy, when search conditions are better, and use other tools like canines that can detect fired cartridge casings and metal detectors to look for that evidence. We encourage comprehensive collection for some of the same reasons that I used to encourage comprehensive collection when I was at ATF, what I'll describe in a minute. Documenting very carefully all of the ground truth that's recovered there, and canvassing the area for other potential evidence, video evidence, other witnesses. Now, I mentioned before that very often citizens believe police know about shootings, but they don't. When police respond, one of the best practices that we encourage, and this is tough in these times of diminished resources, is a basic canvass of the area. Knock on doors. Hey, we got a report of gunfire. We're making sure that everyone's okay. Did you see anything? Did you hear anything? If you do, call us. We care, and we will respond. In a lot of places, when shootings occur, people in the community know who did it. But if they don't trust law enforcement, if they don't think that their information will be used effectively and handled appropriately, they won't call. That's part of the reason that trust with law enforcement is so important. It's also true that canvassing a neighborhood can often turn up evidence, witnesses who are willing to say things. And for those reasons, we really do encourage making that sort of contact with the community. So how do police use ShotSpotter? Well, the obvious use case is rapid and precise response. With 911, someone calls and says, I think I heard gunfire. They basically have no option but to roam around, hope they find a space, hope they come across something. But we give them a precise place to go to, allows them to avoid driving through a crime scene. But at base level, it really just allows them to initiate investigations. And sometimes those are the rudimentary investigations that any police officer is expected to conduct. To say, hey, we got a report of gunfire. Did you see anything? Did you hear anything? It allows them, as I mentioned, to also locate gunshot wound victims, to render aid or to call for emergency aid. You all, as I understand it, are examining evolving police practices. And one of the things that's being discussed is whether or not what is called scoop and run is a better strategy, where police who find victims transport them rather than waiting for EMS. There is research that shows time matters when you're dealing with gunshot wound victims. And occasionally I will hear critics say Shotspotter doesn't lead to many arrests. And I think many arrests is a relative term, but I think it also misunderstands the best use of the technology. The best use is locating victims. Yes, immediate arrests are a measure, but they're not the most important measure. They're certainly not the only measure. Recovered casings are another measure, and just the ability to reassure the community, those are others. So those are ways that police can use ShotSpotter alerts. It's also helpful for locating that ballistic evidence. When I was at ATF, I talked a great deal about crime gun intelligence. Again, those are the tools, the tactics, the technology, the sources of information that allow police to focus on the very small number of people that are using a very small number of guns to commit violent crimes. And one of the ways they do that is through ballistic imaging. You have to have casings, though, to be able to use that tool. Research consistently shows that jurisdictions that use ShotSpotter, and if they employ best practices, increase the amount of ballistic evidence, the casings, that they will recover. This gives detectives leads to pursue. So maybe it's just a practical matter. We spend a lot of time as a society trying to solve homicides. And that makes sense because we want justice for victims. Homicide is our most serious crime. And what the research shows is if you put enough effort into it, you can solve homicides. But we spend a lot less effort and time investigating non-fatal shootings. There is research, though, that shows if the same amount of effort is applied to investigating non-fatal shootings as applied to investigating homicides, police are often much more effective. And sometimes a non-fatal shooting is just that, instead of a homicide, by nothing more than sheer luck. And so having this evidence to go on makes their investigations of these shootings that much more effective. So the casings that are left behind, I don't know if you all have covered it in this class. You may. It's another fairly common topic in the law and policing is the use of ballistic imaging and firearms and tool marks examination. So when a gun is fired, it leaves unique markings from the gun on the casing. Most of those casings are ejected. Semi-automatic firearms typically eject their casings. Some firearms do not eject casings, like revolvers. In the past, police may not know about connections between crime scenes, but by comprehensively collecting the casings left behind at crime scenes and running them through ATF's NIBIN database, National Integrated Ballistic Information Network database, they can automate connections. So casings that are left at one scene can be matched to casings that are left at another scene. And what that does is expand the universe of leads that investigators have to pursue. It can also be used in that same way to connect recovered firearms to casings. So imagine a shooting occurs, something terrible, and someone is injured or killed, but no one is arrested, and casings are left behind. They're recovered and put into NIBIN. Say a week later, a person is arrested for carrying a firearm they're prohibited from having. Say a convicted felon is caught carrying a firearm. If that gun is then test fired and that test fire is put into NIBIN, that gun may connect to that recent shooting. So now a crime that was believed to be a simple possession may actually have some connection to a homicide. And even if the person carrying the firearm is not the perpetrator, they may be a witness. Maybe they got the firearm from someone who did. That's the way that law enforcement is using technology, crime gun intelligence, to improve their investigation of gun crimes, and how ShotSpotter helps by increasing the yield on recovering that evidence. There are other ways police can use this too. So what I've been describing so far are individual alerts. The value of individual alerts seems self-obvious to me, right? Responding quickly, rendering aid, investigating crimes. But in the aggregate, it has value too. It allows police leaders to analyze trends, to find when and where gunfire occurs most often, and to steer their limited resources in that way too. There are other things that this aggregate data is useful for, and I'll describe that in a minute. So how do prosecutors use it? Well, in some of the same ways that investigators do. The evidence shows up in court. It's very often used as one factor among other factors in establishing reasonable suspicion or probable cause. But it can be used for other purposes like knowledge and that sort of thing. So I would like to now give you a quiz. This is your first quiz. You can put your attorney thinking cap on. I'll tell you what you're about to hear. And I want you to think about how you might use it to tell a story. I mentioned that I teach a law class, and in the class we had last night, we talked about the importance of storytelling. Syllogism is not storytelling. And in court, the law is a human endeavor. You have to persuade people, and people understand stories. So you're about to hear two actual ShotSpotter snippets. The first one has 3 rounds of gunfire, and then there will be a pause of a couple of seconds, and then you'll hear a second snippet with 1 round of gunfire. So 3 rounds, a pause, and then 1 round. Listen here. Now that's about the speed that this happened in real life. I'm going to give you some more information. Those first 3 rounds were detected by 11 sensors, but the 4th round was only detected by 4 sensors. And then I will remind you that soft material like the earth has a tendency to absorb acoustic energy, and you can start to visualize what happened here. Those first 3 rounds were fired at a standing victim who fell to the ground. The shooter then walked over and shot him 1 more time as he lay on the ground. The prosecutors that prosecuted that murder argued that the pause between the first 3 and the 4th round was sufficient to allow the defendant to establish premeditation. This case that I've cited here, the Supreme Court of Nebraska, is exactly that case. You can go and read the facts for yourself. It's also one of the earliest cases that upheld the admissibility of ShotSpotter evidence in court. Now, by virtue of what it is the system detects, gunfire in urban areas, most of the time, ShotSpotter evidence is associated with prosecution. But there are actually some very legitimate uses of ShotSpotter evidence for defense. The most obvious is alibi evidence. So if a defendant says, oh, the shooting happened exactly here at exactly this time, well, I have proof that I was over here at exactly that time. It could not have been me. I have a real world example where exactly that happened. It's out of a case it's in a case from Georgia. A defendant successfully argued for a new trial. He used ShotSpotter evidence to show there's no way he could have committed this robbery because he was over here committing this robbery at exactly that same time. That's a true case. I'm not making that up. Now, sometimes defense counsel will ask, hey, do you have an absence of a ShotSpotter alert? No gunfire occurred. Sometimes people are accused of shooting in situations where they did not. And so we will do a diligent search and say, hey, we do not have any ShotSpotter alerts matching the time and location described. Now, that does not mean definitively that no gunfire has occurred. There are reasons the system sometimes will miss gunfire and will qualify our statement, but you can see how that might be valuable. Another real world example, Defense Counsel, it was a legal aid organization, reached out to us and said, we would like a detailed forensic report from Shotspotter. The circumstance was that a specific number of rounds had been fired in a drive-by shooting, 11 rounds. Witnesses said the juvenile defendant shot back. He said, I did not. Police recovered 11 casings. The defense came to us and said, will you produce a report of this event? We did. Our system detected 11 rounds, no 12th round. And using that information, defense got a dismissal of charges for their client. Occasionally, people think that Shotspotter or SoundThinking is adversarial to defense. It's just not true. Our evidence is our evidence. It's up to attorneys to argue its significance and consequence in court. So I mentioned that Shotspotter is often used in reasonable suspicion and probable cause analyses. You all are law students. I'm sure you've covered some of this basic stuff, but these are determined based on the totality of the circumstances. And the court has been very clear. There's no mechanical formula you can follow. This really is a human endeavor. You have to look at all the totality of the circumstances and weigh whether or not it establishes reasonable suspicion or probable cause. If you read the case law across the land, what you'll see is that Shotspotter very often shows up here. Talking about Terry stops specifically, Terry v. Ohio, you'll recall that it requires police to have specific and articulable facts. No generalizations, right? You have to describe specific and articulable facts. And a person's presence in a high crime area alone is not enough to establish reasonable suspicion of a crime. The sad fact of the matter is some people simply live in places where crime is common. But the courts say that a Shotspotter alert is a unique and appropriate factor in assessing the totality of the circumstances, but it must be considered alongside other factors. Now, the factors to be considered are numerous, but the two most important that courts look at are close spatial and temporal proximity. How close was the person detained to where the alert occurred, and how quickly did police get there? There are lots of other factors, as you can imagine. If police show up and there's one person alone, that's very different than if there's a crowd of people and they pluck one person from that crowd. The other basic Fourth Amendment analyses you would go through if you were prosecuting a case or if you were defending a case and arguing for suppression, you'll look at suspect behavior, defendant behavior. Did they appear nervous, evasive? Did they attempt to flee? Were they exhibiting signs that suggested they were concealing a firearm, and that sort of thing? So if you look at the cases involving Shotspotter, those are the sorts of factors that the courts analyze. These are some of the leading cases on this issue. You can see the first three there are federal circuit cases. The fourth case is a Wisconsin Supreme Court case. There are many, many similar cases at district court levels. And they all analyze the circumstances a little bit differently, but all say it's an appropriate factor to be weighed alongside other factors. Occasionally, they'll say Shotspotter alerts no more than like an anonymous tip to 911. I think there are arguments you can make that it's different than that. But even if you do say, well, it's the same as somebody anonymously calling 911 and reporting that they heard gunfire, nobody would question the validity of police responding to that 911 call and conducting an investigation. Now, you can look at the dates of these cases, 2020, 2021, 2022, and you can see that this is an evolving area of law. It probably says something about me, but I have a Westlaw alert set up for every morning at 6 a.m. I get anything yesterday that hit Westlaw that mentions Shotspotter. And most days I'm disappointed when I wake up because the majority of cases that I read mention Shotspotter exactly one time. Police responded to a Shotspotter alert, and then the rest of it is about something else. Sometimes they'll mention ShotSpotter twice. Police responded to a ShotSpotter alert. And then there's a footnote that says ShotSpotter is an acoustic gunshot detection system. The point is, it is increasingly becoming routine evidence in court. This is a quote out of one of those cases. Even 5.5 minutes, both as a matter of fact and as a matter of law, is not too long to believe that a person responsible for a shooting might be in the area. But beyond that, courts do not establish a bright line. If it's a very short time, 1 or 2 minutes, it's usually pretty easy. If it stretches out 5, 10 minutes, it gets tougher. But there are even some cases that have said, hey, it's not unreasonable to believe a person responsible for a shooting may be in that area as much as 30 minutes longer. Like all cases, it really just depends on the totality of the circumstances. So how does ShotSpotter evidence get into court to begin with? Well, there are a couple of questions you have to ask yourself. First, is it pre-trial or is it at trial? And why is it being admitted? If it's being admitted simply to show that police got a report and they responded, it may come in through a police officer who says, I respond to ShotSpotter. I understand that it works this way. I got this report and I went out. If you're using it at trial, you want to introduce an expert witness to describe it, you may end up using a ShotSpotter employee. We do have forensic employees that routinely testify in court. They've testified in more than 300 cases in 23 states. One of the arguments that's often raised is about ShotSpotter's admissibility when those experts testify. You all probably recall from your evidence classes that there are two basic tests for whether or not expert witness testimony is admissible. The first one is FRI. You may recall it's known as the general acceptance test. Basically, a scientific techniques that are generally accepted by the relevant scientific community are admissible. And scientific techniques that are not generally accepted by the relevant scientific community are inadmissible. If a scientific technique is not novel, then no FRI hearing is necessary to determine whether or not it can be admitted. And I submit that ShotSpotter is not novel. It does not use novel technology. It uses cell phones and computers and audio recordings and GPS. The science is not novel. The speed of sound is well established. The concept of time is not in dispute. It does not use novel techniques. Multilateration is widely understood and used, and even the theory of using sound to locate where gunfire occurs from is not novel. We've been doing it for more than 100 years. All of the things that we do are derived from well-recognized scientific principles. Courts generally, when they will look at the issue, ultimately say, look, the credibility and the value of this evidence goes to its weight, not its admissibility. It comes in, and then defense is free to use the greatest engine ever invented for the discovery of truth, cross-examination. But see this one case. This is a California appellate case, one appellate district out of California, Hardy, that said it was an error not to hold a FRI hearing. Not that ShotSpotter was inadmissible, but rather that the court should have had a hearing and did not. That case was resolved before the hearing ever occurred. Now, the federal courts and Most state courts these days use a different standard, the Daubert standard. You may recall from your evidence class, this stems from Federal Rule of Evidence 702. And it applies to scientific, technical, or specialized knowledge, where the judge serves as a gatekeeper, whether or not expert witness testimony should come in. Essentially, it will admit evidence if it's relevant to the prosecution, if it's based on reliable principles and the facts of the case were sufficiently applied. An expert can be deemed to that by their knowledge, their skills, their experience, their training, or their education. So a person need not be a PhD alone to be deemed an expert. In fact, in my prior career at ATF, I regularly testified as an expert witness in federal court involving issues of firearms, their movement in interstate commerce, and how they're used to facilitate the drug trade. So when assessing reliability of technique, courts will look at a number of things. This list is not exhaustive or exclusive, but they'll look at whether or not a theory or technique has been tested, subjected to peer review. Are there a known or potential error rate? Are there standards that govern it? And is there widespread acceptance in the scientific community? It's probably an overstatement to say that there is widespread acceptance of Shotspotter in the scientific community, but there's certainly growing acceptance. So a motion, a Daubert motion is essentially a motion in limine. It is to keep expert witness testimony out, where the argument either attacks the expertise of the witness, this person is not an expert, or the methodology of the process or the underlying science. But even in Daubert jurisdictions, courts generally look at weight and credibility versus admissibility and admit it. Now, how does an appellate court consider a Daubert or Frye issue if the court below admitted testimony but did not hold a hearing? Well, if the court wholly abandoned its responsibility and conducted no analysis at all, the appellate court will review the issue de novo. But if the court below did the analysis of the factors and admitted the evidence, the appellate court will only reverse if it's an abuse of discretion. Here I have cited the case out of the Nebraska Supreme Court that I mentioned, but see this case out of the Seventh Circuit, U.S. v. Godinez. Godinez involved the attempted murder of an ATF agent. The agent was shot in the head. He survived. I believe he is indestructible. I know him. He's a great agent. The gang member that shot him was prosecuted and convicted, and Shotspotter evidence was admitted at trial. Godinez objected, said, I would like to have a Daubert hearing. The trial court conducted its analysis, admitted the Shotspotter evidence. The Seventh Circuit said it was an error not to hold a hearing. It did not say that Shotspotter evidence was not admissible, but rather the court should have held a Daubert hearing, but did not. And the reason is when the court examined the issue, it looked favorably at that State v. Hill case out of Nebraska. But the Seventh Circuit said, well, State v. Hill was more about expertise of the witness, and Godinez was raising methodology or underlying science, distinct enough that the court should have held a hearing, but did not. However, it did not reverse because there was sufficient evidence to convict, and so the case still stands. Last April, I attended oral arguments at the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. I was there as an observer. I wasn't arguing. A defendant in a prosecution in Allegheny County, Wheaton, had raised a confrontation clause objection to Shotspotter evidence that was admitted at his trial. You will recall that the Sixth Amendment guarantees criminal defendants the right to confront witnesses against them. This is the confrontation clause. At trial, Whedon timely objected and said, I should get to confront someone for Shotspotter. Shotspotter was not involved, did not produce a witness at that prosecution. Instead, the prosecution introduced a Shotspotter investigative lead summary. You'll recall that we talked about those through a detective. And the detective described how the system worked, and it was admitted. Whedon objected, said I should get to confront Shotspotter. The lower court, the trial court, overruled the objection. The appellate court also overruled the objection. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, also denied that motion, found that the Shotspotter alert did not violate his confrontation clause rights because it was not testimonial. You'll remember a number of Supreme Court cases established that as the baseline, whether or not evidence is testimonial or not. And in this case, the investigative lead summary was simply a report of this real-time alert that was computer generated to respond to an ongoing emergency, gunfire in an urban area. So I mentioned before that there was value in the aggregate Shotspotter alerts. When I was at ATF, I spent most of my time thinking about how to better investigate, arrest, and prosecute gun offenses. It did not occur to me that aggregate gunfire data may be useful for something other than that. However, the smart people at SoundThinking spend a lot of time thinking about this. And we know that gunfire and gun crime is very localized. The resources that can be deployed to communities are not endless. And so rather than deploy them like peanut butter, where you spread them evenly across, by using this aggregate data, you can really steer resources to the places that could use them most. The other way that it can be used is to intervene in the cycle of violence. So we know that a lot of shootings are retaliatory. Many times, people who are close to the community may recognize where one shooting may precipitate another shooting because they can understand which groups were involved. And by sending credible messengers to intercede, may be able to disrupt that violence before it occurs. That's one of the emerging uses that some organizations have started using Shotspotter information for in partnership with their local police. How can schools use Shotspotter? Well, research is still emerging, but seems to suggest that long-term exposure, chronic exposure to gunfire can have significant consequences, especially for young people. So even when someone isn't the direct victim of gunfire, living in a place where they're exposed to it can have real consequences for their learning, for their general well-being. It can manifest itself in a substance abuse or other behavior. And so by using this information to identify students who may be exposed to it, for instance, we know gunfire occurred in the neighborhood where this student lives last night. Administrators can help steer limited resources there, trauma-informed care to the kids that might benefit from it the most. This is, of course, an emerging area of research, but it's something that I think has a pretty broad agreement that better care and early intervention can have positive consequences for individuals specifically and for communities generally. How can researchers use Shotspotter? Well, in the aggregate, it can be used for a lot of things, like measuring the efficacy of interventions. So by measuring, for instance, the implementation of a curfew, you can see what consequences it has for the rate of, say, gunfire. Interestingly, exactly that kind of research has been done using ShotSpotter information, and the results are counterintuitive. So you would think that imposing a curfew on young people would reduce the number of shootings. But in fact, research tends to show that the opposite occurs. The theory is that with fewer people out on the street to report, some of the people that engage in shootings feel emboldened to do more of it. Again, this is just one way that researchers can use it. They could use it to measure other things too, where precise geolocated and time-stamped gunfire data is useful. About privacy. I'm sometimes asked about the privacy implications of our tool. The company was concerned about that enough ourselves that we sought an independent audit by New York University Law School's policing project. And their conclusion was that the tool poses a low risk to individual privacy for a number of reasons, many of which I described, like sensors being high in public locations. There's no ability to live stream audio. Some of our policies for restricting access to audio. The report that the policing project produced, they had free license to write as they wanted. They had unrestricted access to all of our policies. We actually adopted a number of the recommendations that they made. You can find the report on the policing project's website, but we also host it on our website too. That, in a nutshell, is acoustic gunshot detection evidence and ShotSpotter. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to engage in some Q&A if that's what you'd like, Jessalyn.
I would love nothing more. Tom, thank you so much for that really comprehensive overview. I definitely learned a lot more about the technology offered, as well as how it's been used, and yeah, the different ways in which it has been deployed since its origins. I have some questions, but I have more access to you, so I want to give the floor to my students first. Folks, what are our thoughts? What are our reactions? What are we thinking? Kimberly.
Hi, Tom. Thank you again, just like Jessalyn said, for sacrificing a little bit of your Friday evening to come talk to us. We really, really appreciate it. You actually didn't touch on this at all, and I'm just asking this out of curiosity because I did take business fundamentals last year, and so that's kind of in the back of my brain. And my question is, how does SoundThinking balance their fiduciary duty to maximize profit for their shareholders alongside what seems to be their priority to aid in improving community confidence? Yeah, is this like a delicate balance? I'm just curious.
Oh, that's actually a great question. And as much as I have talked about ShotSpotter in the media and in presentations and in my private life, I don't think anyone has asked me that yet. It's a great question. And I will tell you what I have told other people. I spent all of my adult life working in public service. I actually became a federal employee when I was 19 years old. I was a paid intern. I became an agent at another agency before I came and worked for ATF. I worked at ATF for 23 plus years. Total, I spent almost 27 years in service to my country. I am motivated by an interest in doing that sort of thing. When I retired, I came to work for this company because I believe in its incredible potential to save lives, reduce crime, and make policing better. Those are things that matter to me. But when you retire from law enforcement, people sometimes warn you, oh, you're going to see it's all about the bottom line in the private sector. And I have not felt that at all. Now, of course, this company has to stay profitable, to stay in business, to do the good that it does. But My experience has been that this is a company that is genuinely interested in doing what it says it does. As an unofficial motto, company has adopted work that matters as its slogan there. And the tone really starts at the top. Our CEO could not be more genuine about that message. We do good work. We want to be a profitable company. We want to have more customers, but and honestly, it is motivated as much as by a desire to do good as it is to make profit. If you're interested, I really do encourage you to go to the company's website. Every year we produce an ESG report. You can find it there. There's much more information available about the company there, the things that it does. You can follow our stock ticker price, SSTI on the NASDAQ. So anyways, I hope that at least touches on your question. We have a board of directors that has to look at those things. I mean, it's probably not lost on the world that one of our prominent directors is somebody who's committed his entire professional life to making policing better. That really is a driving force for us.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. And I'm really glad that you were able to tackle that question. I know it's a bit tough, but it really is interesting to me to see how companies can maybe some way, somehow get involved and help improve the community. And that's definitely an angle that's interesting to me. So thank you so much.
So there are a number of initiatives that the company has involved itself in. You can read about them on the web page. Our Data for Good project is sort of an initiative writ large, but we've also signed up just to support a couple of like ground level entities. One of the things that's very important to me is the Officer Down Memorial page. Officers killed in the line of duty. We raised money and donated to ODMP. We do a lot of cool things at this company. Every day I'm thinking, wow, this is really neat stuff. That was one of the best things, just an opportunity to give back in a way that really wasn't about the bottom line.
Great. Thank you so much. And just really quickly to wrap up, Tom, is there an email that we can reach out to you or a LinkedIn? What works best for you?
So I would love it if you would find me on LinkedIn. I'm not yet a LinkedIn influencer, but I do write about things. I write about gunshot detection evidence. I write about case law, especially involving criminal law, Fourth Amendment issues, Second Amendment issues, and other stuff on there. I'm not hard to find on LinkedIn. Please, by all means, reach out. I'd love to stay in touch.
I can second that. Tom is very active and posts some very interesting articles. So I'll drop the link to his profile in the chat momentarily. And just to really commend, what I appreciate from what I'm hearing is your dedication and your passion for what you do. So as someone who leads with passion and enthusiasm, it's very it's contagious, and I appreciate hearing that. Melody, you have your hand raised. Melody.
Hi,
Sorry, we had a Melanie.
Hi. Yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. I apologize. I'm on the Zoom in two places right now. I am traveling. Unfortunately, we're traveling home from a funeral. So as we're talking about technology and policing, I'm appreciating technology that's letting me be here and participate from the road. So thank you for patience with my tech issues. And I appreciate the lecture. Thank you, Tom, for all of that information. That's incredibly helpful and valuable. And for my part, I have been doing research actually around Shotspotter. So it's something I'm very interested in, and how the tech works and how police are utilizing it across the country. And I have a question related to how sounds are classified, or specifically when sounds become like a false positive, as you would call them. And I know I've read the Edward Edgeworth economics report, and you have a very low false positive rate. And I'm just curious how that happens, if you could speak to that. Is it that a gunshot is detected and it remains categorized as so unless and until police inform you otherwise? Or when does that happen, if that makes sense, what I'm kind of asking?
It does. So first, Melody, like you, I really take advantage of technology. I handle a lot of Zoom calls from my phone. I taught a law class from my hotel room here last night. And so no worries. I'm glad that you were able to dial in. Yes, it makes sense what you're saying. So I'm impressed that you read the Edgeworth Analytics report. What Melody's talking about, remember that I said back at the beginning, we make certain guarantees to our customers. We will be right 90% of the time. That's important for a number of reasons. If our system was not right, they would start to lose faith in it. Police would stop using it. And that's not good for us. So we give them a financial incentive to give us feedback. That's how we encourage them to tell us. The fact of the matter is, when we publish alerts, most of the time they go into the ether, and we just don't know what's on the other side of it. We have detected and classified gunfire, and we've published it. And it could be celebratory gunfire, or it could be homicidal gunfire. We just don't know. Sometimes we make mistakes. It's the reason that we set our guarantee at 90%, not 100%. Occasionally, we will miss gunfire. Police will call and say, hey, we have a gunshot wound victim here, but we did not get a ShotSpotter alert. What happened? And so we'll examine it and try and determine what happened. How did we miss this? Did the system miss it? Did a human make an error? The opposite is a false positive. And that's what Melody was talking about, where we publish a sound that we believed was gunfire, but it turns out it was not gunfire. Police show up and say, hey, we went out there. We responded within 2 minutes of you sending us the alert. And right where the alert was, we found kids playing with fireworks. There's no reason anyone should believe that 2 minutes after a gunfight occurred, kids ran out into the street and started playing with firecrackers. So the firecracker was probably the sound that the system detected that we misclassified. We keep track of those things. We encourage our customers to tell us that, because that's important to us, making sure the system stays accurate. Calculating all of those false negatives and all of the false positives reported back to us by our customers, which is basically the only source of ground truth we have. We calculate our error rate or our accuracy rate. That Edgeworth Analytics report, which you can find on our website, puts our accuracy rate at around 97%. Most of the mistakes that we make are false negatives, where we either don't detect gunfire or whether we misclassified gunfire, but sometimes it's the opposite.
Molly.
Hello. I had a few questions that I missed just the beginning of your presentation, but I was wondering how exactly, because you mentioned that it picks up gunshots, but are the sensors recording at all times and then only those loud noises get transmitted to IRC? And if not, like, what actually prevents other noises from being transmitted there? Is there like a policy that you guys have that keeps those noises from being transmitted? And then in addition, I was curious exactly how loud percussive noises are defined. Like, is it a certain, I know you kind of showed the waveform, but I guess how that interacts with my other question is, like, how exactly is that data being like kept in the sensors, or is it held for a certain amount of time before it gets transmitted? And then I don't know, like how does that actually work is my first question.
Yeah. So the sensors operate independently. The first level of filtering, you might call it spatial filtering. It's not really filtering. It's just that the sensors are spread out over an area, such a distance that only sounds that are loud enough to reach 3 or more trigger the system. Each of the sensors operates independently. It does not constantly stream audio back. It keeps it on board. And if it detects a loud, impulsive sound, it reports it to a location server. But only if 3 or more report the same sound, and the location server can resolve it and say, hey, you have all reported the same loud sound, is audio then captured and transmitted to a central place as part of an incident. The system then filters through, and it's much more complicated than I think I could explain here, but I do encourage you to go and look at the patent if you're interested in the different ways that it filters out, looking for things like the waveform, the amplitude, the decay, that sort of thing. There's also a report that we produced based on a live fire test in Pittsburgh. It's also hosted on our website. I posted it on my LinkedIn too, and I captioned it, if you only read one academic report about multilateration this year, make it this one. It's pretty deep reading and hard for a normal non-science guy like me to get through. I had to read it slow. But when you do, you start seeing, okay, this makes sense to me. And so if you have interest in how the system operates at that deep a level, I encourage you to go and look for it. We have actually posted some of our data on GitHub, I think. That's not a thing that I use, but it's a thing that sciencey people use, where a person can go there and see the algorithms and use some of the data and run some of their own tests there. So anyways, each of the system sensors operates independently. The audio is recorded on a spool and then recorded over. It is not transmitted anywhere. It stays there local, except when 3 or more sensors detect the same loud impulsive sound, and then it's triggered, and that's when it captures the audio, just that. I hope that answers your question. It sounds like a very technical question you were asking.
I think so. Yeah, I know that's kind of what I was really, and you did answer, thinking more like when exactly it gets transmitted. So thank you. I have a few more, but I'll wait. We'll rotate around. Thank you.
Melody.
Hi, thank you. And thank you for answering my previous question too. That was very helpful. And I have another question that's a little outside of the scope of your presentation today again, so my apologies. But I heard you speak on a podcast called Cop Talk last year, and there you referenced that there was a leadership change in what was Shotspotter at the time in 2011. And with that change, also the company changed in how they were reviewing alerts, and that led to increased performance of the technology. And at the time you said you could speak more on that. It was at like the end of the podcast, but I'm curious if you could speak more to what that change was.
Yeah, happy to. First of all, I'm flattered that you took the time to listen to me on Cop Talk. I mentioned that our CEO is a man named Ralph Clark. Ralph's a Harvard business guy, and he came in and changed how the company did business. Prior to his arrival, ShotSpotter was an on-premises hardware solution. We literally sold the sensors to our customers, and they did review themselves. Very often it occurred in the dispatch. And dispatchers, of course, were already overworked. Now, they received some training from the company. Here's how you distinguish gunfire from not gunfire. But it was not a great way to go about it, because one of two things happened. Either the dispatchers were not confident in their ability to distinguish gunfire from not, so they published way too much, and the system would risk becoming the burglar alarm of gunshot detection, where cops would say, this is probably nothing. And we don't want them to become complacent. We do want them to have confidence in the system. Or the opposite occurs, where they basically ignored the system and published anything, and people thought it didn't work. So Ralph changed the business model. The company now operates as a software as a service product. where we maintain all of the sensors. We do all of the review. Our customers simply have a subscription to our gunshot detection service. That's the business change that I was talking about.
Thank you. That makes sense. If I can sneak in another question, I know we have more before we move off of me again. I was curious if you have any information about how the sensors are maintained. Are they recalibrated ever or cleaned? Like, how does that happen when, if maybe you can become aware if it's not working, but how are they maintained just on a regular basis?
Well, that probably goes beyond the scope of my expertise. Each of the sensors regularly reports back to the location server saying, hey, I'm still active, I'm still online. If a sensor stopped working, it gets prioritized for maintenance or replacement or whatever. But that's not a part of the company I deal with, so I'm not sure how all of that occurs. I just know that we maintain awareness of the sensors.
That's fair. Thank you.
I'm going to sneak in with some moderator's privilege before turning to Molly. So, Tom, I'm curious if you can do a bit of future casting for us in terms of sound thinking. Obviously, you have intimate knowledge of the organization. And what we have seen is while some communities are adopting this technology, others are turning away from it. And there has been additional peer reviews around community perception around the value added of it. So with some of the changes that we've seen in some pretty large metropolitan areas in terms of this technology, where do you see sound thinking going? What changes, if any, do you anticipate the company taking based off of some of the feedback that has been received from cities where contracts were or are held?
Well, as I mentioned before, the company is evolving into a platform service. As with basically any tool, it's more effective when it's used in concert with other tools. I mentioned video surveillance in a lot of places. Communities have integrated. They've put Shotspotter into their real-time crime centers. We have other products that our system integrates with. The company's square mileage covered has been expanding. And I often hear people say, oh, some cities have canceled ShotSpotter. But I think that cherry picks a fairly small number of customers. We're approaching nearly 170 cities. The square mileage covered grows all the time. And we have had a few that have not renewed over time. Those are decisions that they have to make locally. But I think the forecast for the company looks really good because a lot of people do see the value. You'll see many of our customers point to it as an essential part of their strategy. Detroit reported the lowest homicide rates had in something like 40 years, and the chief in his public remarks specifically named ShotSpotter as one of the factors in that. I also think it's important to look at what the tool's purpose is. So different places want different things from it. I occasionally hear people say ShotSpotter didn't reduce crime. Well, by that measure, 911 didn't reduce crime and ballistic imaging didn't reduce crime either. Of course, we all want lower crime, but I don't think you can lay crime rates alone singly at ShotSpotter's feet. And besides that, that's not the only thing it does. As I mentioned, one of its best uses is helping get aid to people to increase the amount of evidence that they can recover. Even reports, academic reports that some critics will point to that says ShotSpotter doesn't reduce crime. In those exact same reports, it says very plainly the product does what the vendor says it will do. It reports shootings faster, more closely. Police recover more ballistic evidence and more firearms. And so the short answer to your question is I think the prospects look good. I do think that law enforcement as a profession is struggling. There's so much information. if used effectively, it can really make them more efficient. The challenge is taking all of this information, layering it together, and using it in a productive way. I also think that communities should look at things like the cost of gun violence at a larger scale. I know this because I spent time as a government bureaucrat. It's very easy to get caught up on dollar figures on a spreadsheet. But we know the economic cost of gun violence is astronomical. There are the direct costs, right? The healthcare costs for people who are wounded, many of whom do not have healthcare insurance. There are the costs of things like policing and emergency aid. But there's also less direct costs like lost economic prosperity. And there's, of course, the human cost that it's very difficult to quantify. I think when communities do look at the bigger picture, consider how this tool can be used in ways like what I described, and not just in the narrow ways that some people think it should be used. I think they see the value of the product. It's the reason we have so many loyal customers.
I appreciate that. Molly, and then I will say I do have to leave at 1:45, so I can hand over hosting privileges to someone else if we wanted the conversation to go until the end of the hour, but just wanted that to be noted. But Molly.
Thank you. I will try to be quick. I guess, well, the one thing I kind of wanted to touch on, just speaking of current events in the future, I did read an article recently about some of the, I know you mentioned part of the objective is to have the locations be secret, but I know a lot of those were just leaked. So, and I know this is a recent thing and I don't know how much you want to talk about it, but is there a discussion about like needing to move those, or like I don't know, I guess I'll keep it open-ended. What might be the strategy going forward now that those locations are more publicly known?
So I would encourage you to go back and read the Wired article and see who the spokesperson on behalf of the company is, and what he said is what I'll rest on here.
Gotcha. Thank you. I wasn't sure. I was just curious.
It was me.
Okay.
Yeah. And look, I mean, I will rest on what I said in the article.
Okay. Thank you.
You're not putting me on the spot. It's fine. As I said there, as I've said here, we think it's important to keep that information secret. That article disclosed sensor information at a very high level. It did not include individual sensor locations, thank goodness, because I think that it really would pose a risk of danger and harassment to the people that hosted those sensors. I think that there is legitimate public interest in knowing where the tool is deployed. I spoke before the California State Assembly on issues of policing and privacy. And I said there, and I'll say here, and I'll say publicly anywhere else, I believe the adoption of police technology should have a broad support, informed input. I am not someone that thinks the sky is falling. I do not think that technology is bad and that it erodes all of our civil liberties. I think that we can have civil liberties and policing, constitutional policing, and technology altogether. I think that it warrants dialogue. I think that appropriate policy and oversight are important, and the way you get to those things is by discussing. It's the reason I'm willing to talk to people, even when they're difficult situations. I mentioned our CEO, Ralph Clark. You can go back and look. He spoke at a hearing in Chicago recently. It became very contentious. These are not comfortable things for him or me or others at the company to do, but we believe in what we're doing here. And as much as anything, what we see is that many people simply have misunderstandings about the tool. To the extent that we can help correct those, we want to. And look, reasonable people can disagree. At the end of the day, I may not see things the same way our critics do, but that's okay. That's one of the best things about America.
Thank you. I appreciate your response. I was interested, and I was going to ask a little bit about. Well, you answered all my questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That is not something I have been tracking, so thank you for flagging. Derek.
Yeah, just a quick one. Thank you, Tom. Can you speak to costs at all, reducing costs? I know some states have expressed hesitancy and concerns over the high cost of the program. I don't know if you're able to make any comment on that, because that does seem like a way to address, might make a lot of people happy just by making the service a little bit cheaper. So
Yeah.
if you can speak to that at all.
Well, it's a tough one, and I don't know how good a job I can do at addressing what you want. I mean, the fact of the matter is we're a publicly traded for-profit company. The tool, I think, when you look at it and big picture, is not that expensive. There are, especially when compared to the cost of gun violence. Our CEO recently wrote an op-ed. I really encourage you to go and read it. It was very good, I think, in the Chicago Defender. What's the life worth? There are a number of ways that communities can afford to buy these things. It's a matter of prioritizing, for one. Occasionally, I will see critics say, oh, ShotSpotter's expensive, we have to get rid of it to do this other thing, as if there is some just either or choice. And I just don't think that that's right. You don't have either ShotSpotter or adequate policing. You don't have either ShotSpotter or constitutional policing. You can have all of these things. It does require some prioritization, some hard decision making. The federal government has provided a lot of funding. The Department of Justice is 100% behind use of crime gun intelligence to address gun violence. And the White House in executive orders has made specific reference to using technology like acoustic gunshot detection evidence. So there are funds available. Sometimes it's funded by grants. Sometimes, though, community leaders look at it and say, this is important to us and we're going to pay for it directly out of our budgets. Something else, and I don't remember who said it, but the question was about public support. Occasionally, someone will say, you have a lot of critics, and that's not true. We have some loud critics, but we don't have a lot of critics. What we do have is a lot of supporters, sentiment surveys of community members, police leaders, elected officials. Many people support the idea of using this tool to do the good that I've described that it can be used to do. Look, I wish that every city in America put ShotSpotter all across their place. In my mind, this thing is equivalent to the smoke detector of gunfire. This is the sort of thing that can help save lives. And I just can't fathom why someone wouldn't think that it would be a good use of technology to know when and where gunfire occurs in our cities.
I feel like we could probably keep you all weekend with different questions exploring this area. But
I really appreciate you all listening. I appreciate you all taking it seriously. So tell me if I'm right. You all are law students, is that right?
correct.
So I will say the same thing to you all that I said to my law students. I teach at a law school, not because it pays me a lot. It doesn't. As an adjunct, when I factor out how much work goes into preparing for it, I would say I get paid roughly minimum wage. I do it because I really love it. I see so many smart kids, and I'm fortunate in my position. I very often get to speak to congressional staffers. Many of them are young law students or young lawyers too. And I see the great opportunities that they have to make things better. I really admire you all for taking on something like this, spending time talking about it, thinking critically about these issues. That's the way that our profession will progress, profession being law enforcement. So anyways, I'm really honored that you guys invited me. I'm glad that you listen. I'm impressed at the research and homework you all did in preparation. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. Yeah, fascinating rewarding.
Awesome.
Yeah. Enjoy your weekend.
Yeah.
Be safe, be well, and we look forward to continuing to follow your good work.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
Right. Cheers. Thank you, Tom. Please hold.